You ever wondered about the history on the number of people the US employed in its military history? Today, I'm walking you through the history on the size of the US military over the past 200 years. From 1820 to 2024, the United States has seen everything from westward expansion to the Civil War, from World War I to World War II, from the Cold War to Vietnam, and from Afghanistan to Iraq. Join me for this epic visualization on the number of active military personnel the US employed, and the story behind each decade. Stick around, and we'll see how all that may change in this decade in the face of new global conflicts in 2024 and beyond. I guarantee you'll learn something new. The 1820s was an important decade in the United States, not only in terms of political and social changes, but also for the nation's military structure. The military size fluctuated throughout the decade, beginning with a force of approximately 15,000 active duty personnel in 1820, and experienced a slight decrease in the subsequent years. This decade was marked by significant events that had direct and indirect impacts on the military size and spending. One of the pivotal moments was the establishment of the first permanent frontier outposts by the U.S. Army. This expansion was a strategic move to protect settlers and traders, thereby increasing the military presence in the West. The need for protection and security in these regions likely contributed to the slight increase in military size, particularly towards the latter half of the decade. Another significant event of the 1820s that shaped the future of the military was the declaration of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. This policy asserted the U.S. opposition to European colonialism in the Americas. It was a bold statement that demonstrated America's growing confidence on the global stage. The Monroe Doctrine not only shaped the nation's foreign policy but also set the stage for future military engagements. This perhaps contributed to the maintenance of a sizable military force throughout the decade, ensuring readiness for any potential conflicts. On the home front, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was a crucial development in domestic politics. It addressed the contentious issue of slavery in new territories. While the compromise managed to maintain a delicate balance between the free and slave states, it also sowed the seeds for future conflicts. The possibility of these conflicts likely influenced military planning and involvement, and could have played a role in the decision to maintain a steady number of active duty personnel throughout the decade. In the 1830s, the United States experienced a considerable shift in the size of its active duty military. The fluctuations in the number of enlisted individuals throughout this decade were influenced by several key events and circumstances. The decade began with an active duty count of approximately 12,000 in 1830. However, the following year saw a slight decrease in the number of military members. This was likely due to the changing landscape of the country's needs and strategies, as well as the shifting political climate during this period. One of the key events that had a significant impact on the size of the military was the implementation of the Indian Removal Act in 1830. This act led to the forced relocation of Native American tribes, a process which involved U.S. military forces. The enforcement of this act necessitated a significant number of military members, leading to an increase in the active duty count in the years following its introduction. Around the same period, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers embarked on several major infrastructure projects, such as road and canal construction. These projects expanded the roles of the military and required a larger force for their execution. This likely contributed to the increase in military size observed from 1832 to 1835. The Second Seminole War, which began in 1835 and extended until 1842, was another significant event that influenced the size of the military. This conflict resulted in the forced removal of Seminole tribes from Florida. The execution of this operation required a substantial deployment of military resources, which is likely the reason for the notable increase in the active duty count to 17,000 in 1836 and a peak of 22,000 in 1837. However, the active duty count decreased to 18,000 in 1838, possibly due to the winding down of some military operations. Despite this, the number of military members remained relatively high, reaching 19,000 in 1839. In the 1840s, the United States military went through a significant period of change and growth, reflecting the events of the time. In 1840, the military had approximately 22,000 active duty members. As the decade progressed, there were fluctuations, but an overall trend of growth is evident, particularly towards the mid to late part of the decade. A crucial event that significantly impacted the size of the military was the Mexican-American War that spanned from 1846 to 1848. This conflict resulted in substantial territorial gains for the United States. Naturally, to secure and manage these new territories, the nation required an increased number of personnel in active duty. Consequently, the military size saw a sharp rise, with the number of active duty members reaching an unprecedented 39,000 in 1846 and further swelling to 58,000 and 60,000 in 1847 and 1848 respectively. Education also played a significant role in the evolution of the military during this decade. In 1845, the U.S. Naval Academy was established in Annapolis, Maryland. This institution was aimed at improving the training of naval officers, which indirectly contributed to the increase in military size. With better trained officers graduating from the academy, the overall quality and effectiveness of the military force were enhanced. Domestic security events also contributed to the changes. The California Gold Rush was a particularly influential event. The U.S. Army was tasked with providing protection and maintaining order during this period of intense gold prospecting that started in 1848. This necessitated an increased military presence in the region, contributing to the military's increased size. However, by 1849, the number of active duty members decreased to 23,000. This reduction could be attributed to the end of the Mexican-American War and the stabilization of regions affected by the gold rush. In conclusion, the 1840s was a decade of expansion and transformation for the United States military, characterized by various key events. These events not only shaped the military's size but also influenced the nation's spending on defense and military education. The changes that occurred during this decade laid the groundwork for the future development of the U.S. military. In the 1860s, the United States military underwent a significant transformation in terms of size and structure. The decade started with a relatively small active duty force of around 28,000. However, with the onset of the American Civil War in 1861, there was a massive mobilization of military forces. The Union Army from the northern states managed to amass a considerable force, reaching a peak strength of around 1 million soldiers by 1864. This sharp increase was partly due to the Enrollment Act of 1863, which introduced conscription and significantly boosted the number of Union Army soldiers. On the other side of the conflict, the Confederate Army, representing the seceded southern states, also rallied a considerable force, mustering approximately 750,000 soldiers during the war. The military engagement was fierce, with notable battles such as the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, which became a turning point in the war. Union forces successfully repelled a Confederate invasion of the North, demonstrating their superior numbers and strategic planning. Furthermore, the siege of Vicksburg in the same year resulted in a major Union victory, securing control of the Mississippi River and effectively splitting the Confederacy. By 1864, the Union's military might was strongly felt, with General William T. Sherman's march to the sea demonstrating the Union's ability to conduct total war. Sherman's campaign resulted in the destruction of Southern infrastructure and morale, showcasing the military prowess of an army that had grown to over 1 million soldiers. The war effectively ended with the surrender of Confederate General Robert East Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. By this time, the active duty force had reached its peak at 1.06 million. However, President Abraham Lincoln's assassination just days after the war's end plunged the nation into mourning, marking a somber end to a period of massive military expansion. In the post-war period, the active duty force drastically reduced to around 77,000 by 1866. The military, however, remained involved in the nation's affairs through the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, helping with the occupation and rebuilding of the war-torn southern states. During this period, the military also saw significant strides in terms of diversity and modernization. The U.S. Army established the Buffalo Soldiers, African American regiments that served on the western frontier. Simultaneously, the U.S. Navy began modernizing its fleet, introducing ironclad warships and adapting to new naval technologies. In summary, the 1860s was a decade of significant change for the U.S. military. From a relatively small force, the military saw a massive increase in size due to the Civil War, followed by a reduction and transition to a more diverse and modern force in the post-war period. In the 1870s, the United States military was a significant entity, both domestically and internationally. The decade started with a substantial force of 50,000 active duty members in 1870. However, the size of the military fluctuated over the decade, reflecting the dynamic period in American history. One of the key factors affecting the military was the country's relationship with the Native American tribes. The U.S. Army was deeply involved in the Indian Wars, a series of conflicts that demanded ongoing commitments from the military. This continuous engagement required a large and robust force, which partially explains the relatively high count of 42,000 in both 1871 and 1872. Simultaneously, the U.S. was expanding its global reach, particularly in the Pacific. The annexation of the Midway Islands in 1867 by the U.S. Navy marked a significant step in this expansion. This strategic move necessitated a robust naval force to maintain and protect the new territories, which might have contributed to the increase in the military force to 43,000 in 1873. However, the count dropped to 38,000 in 1875, possibly due to the economic depression triggered by the Panic of 1873. This financial crisis strained military budgets, reducing resources and consequently the size of the force. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which limited the use of military forces in domestic law enforcement, also had an influence. The act reshaped the role of the military, restricting its involvement in civilian matters. This shift in function might be one reason for the lower count of 36,000 in 1878. The military's role in domestic issues was further highlighted during the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The U.S. Army was tasked with quelling the labor unrest, a reflection of the growing domestic challenges of the time. This involvement necessitated a slightly larger force, as evidenced by the increase in the count to 38,000 in 1879. All in all, the size of the U.S. military in the 1870s was influenced by a variety of factors, from foreign relations and expansionism to domestic politics and economic conditions. The constant ebb and flow of the count over the decade underscores the dynamic role the military played in this transformative period in American history. In the 1880s, the United States military was characterized by a steady count of active duty service members, with figures hovering around 38,000 to 39,000 throughout the decade. This period was marked by certain significant events that had a profound influence on the military size and spending. The decade began with a consistent count of 38,000 active duty personnel for 3 consecutive years: 1880, 1881, and 1882. However, in 1883, there was a slight decline to 37,000, which could be attributed to the Pendleton Act of 1883. This act brought about a significant reform in the civil service system, impacting military appointments and promotions. It replaced the spoils system with competitive exams, which could have resulted in a temporary reduction in the recruitment of military personnel. The military count rebounded to 39,000 in 1884, a figure that remained constant for the rest of the decade. This increase and subsequent stability can be linked to the expansion of U.S. naval power overseas. The U.S. Navy began to establish its presence in Hawaii with a coaling station supporting global power projection. This move likely necessitated an increase in military personnel to manage the strategic and logistical demands of this expansion. Simultaneously, domestic challenges were also present. For instance, the U.S. Army was actively involved in the suppression of labor disputes such as the Great Southwest Railroad Strike of 1886. This domestic involvement highlighted the need for a consistent military force to deal with internal issues. On another front, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had an indirect effect on the military. This act, which restricted Chinese immigration, could have affected the diversity of the military labor pool, as individuals of Chinese descent had been a part of the military workforce until then. Finally, the decade ended on a somber note with the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. This event marked the end of the Indian Wars and reflected the ongoing military conflicts with Native American tribes. These conflicts were likely a significant factor in maintaining a consistent military force during this decade. In summary, the 1880s represented a period of steady military presence, influenced by both domestic events and overseas expansion. Through it all, the active duty count remained relatively stable, reflecting the adaptability of the U.S. military in response to various challenges and changes. In the early 1890s, the size of the United States military stayed relatively stable. With approximately 39,000 men serving in active duty in 1890 and 1892, to a slight decrease in 1891 to 38,000, the military size didn't see any significant alterations. This stability could be attributed to a period of relative peace and no significant international conflicts involving the U.S. However, the year 1893 saw an impactful event that reverberated through all sectors of American society, including the military. The Panic of 1893 led to a severe economic depression. Naturally, it affected military budgets and resources. Despite the economic downturn, the military size remained consistent at 39,000, demonstrating the nation's resilience in maintaining its defense system even amid challenging times. Mid-decade, the military size experienced a gradual increase. In 1894 and continuing in 1895 and 1896, the number of active duty soldiers rose to 42,000, reflecting an increased need for military personnel. This period also marked the start of naval modernization as the U.S. Navy began to evolve its fleet, constructing new battleships to keep pace with changing naval technologies. This necessitated additional manpower, contributing to the increase in military size. By 1897, the military had further expanded to 44,000 active duty personnel, perhaps in anticipation of the upcoming Spanish-American War. This war, occurring in 1898, resulted in the U.S. gaining control of overseas territories. This significant expansion required a higher military presence and resources. As a result, the military size saw a dramatic increase, surging to 236,000 soldiers, an unprecedented increase compared to previous years. In the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. Navy firmly established itself in the Caribbean, leasing Guantanamo Bay from Cuba. This move extended its regional influence and necessitated a sustained increase in military personnel. By the end of the decade in 1899, even though the military size reduced to 100,000, it was still considerably higher than the numbers at the decade start. This year also marked the beginning of the Philippine-American War, a conflict that emerged from U.S. territorial acquisitions, further demanding a strong military presence. In summary, the 1890s saw significant fluctuations in the size of the U.S. military, influenced by various key events ranging from economic crises to overseas conflicts and territorial expansions. At the start of the 20th century, the United States military was in a state of flux. The year 1900 marked a significant increase in the number of active duty personnel, reaching as high as 126,000. This sudden rise can be attributed to the U.S. military intervention in the Boxer Rebellion in China, a conflict that symbolized America's increasing global engagement. The rebellion had necessitated the involvement of the U.S. military to protect foreign interests, leading to an expansion of the active duty force. The following year, 1901, saw a decrease in military personnel to 112,000. Continuing in this downward trend, the numbers dwindled further to 111,000 by 1902 and 106,000 in 1903. This could be due to the resolution of overseas conflicts and the military's focus pivoting towards reform and education. The year 1903 marked the passage of the Militia Act, also known as the Dick Act, which brought about significant changes in the National Guard system. This act led to an improvement in the organization and training of the Guard, creating a more efficient and effective military force. This reformative period may have contributed to the slight decline in active duty personnel as the focus shifted to improving the existing force rather than expanding it. By 1904, the number of military personnel increased slightly again to 110,000 and remained relatively stable around 108,000 in 1905 and 1907, with a brief rise to 112,000 in 1906. This period of stability coincides with a significant event in the U.S. military history, the establishment of the Army War College. This institution was created to provide advanced military education and improve officer training, contributing to the enhancement of military readiness. In 1907, amidst a steady military count, the United States faced the Panic of 1907, a severe financial crisis that affected various sectors, including the military. Military budgets and resources were strained, potentially affecting the maintenance and recruitment of active duty personnel. Despite the economic downturn, the following year saw a significant increase in military personnel to 129,000. This rise can be linked to President Theodore Roosevelt's Naval Expansion Initiative. Known for his big stick diplomacy, Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet on a world tour, showcasing U.S. naval power and global reach. This display of strength required a bolstered military force, leading to an increase in active duty personnel. By the end of the decade, in 1909, the United States military personnel reached its peak for the period at 142,000. The rise and fall in military personnel over the first decade of the 20th century exemplify the dynamic nature of military force size, influenced by various factors such as conflict, reform, education, and economic conditions. The 1910s were a transformative period for the United States military, marked by significant increases in size and capabilities. In 1910, the military was considerably modest, consisting of around 139,000 active duty members. However, this number began to rise steadily, likely due to increasing regional challenges, such as the Mexican Revolution, which began the same year and lasted until 1920. This event led to U.S. military interventions, including the Pershing Expedition, which surely contributed to the growing military size. By 1912, the active duty count had risen to 153,000, and it continued to grow as the United States faced the looming threat of global conflict. The outbreak of World War I in 1914, for instance, led to a significant expansion of the military, reaching 166,000 active duty members that year. The war prompted the modernization of the U.S. military, with the introduction of new technologies and tactics. This modernization was reflected in the establishment of the U.S. Army Air Service in 1918, marking the inception of U.S. military aviation. The enactment of the Selective Service Act in 1917, which established conscription, was a major factor propelling the growth of the U.S. Army. The number of active duty members skyrocketed to 644,000 that year, reflecting the urgent need for soldiers. By the end of the war, the U.S. Army had ballooned to over 4 million soldiers, with about half of them deployed overseas. They participated in major battles such as Cantigny, Château-Thierry, Belleau Wood, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The American forces, led by General John J. Pershing, played a crucial role in the final Allied offensives of 1918. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy also expanded its submarine fleet and introduced convoy systems to counter German U-boat attacks during the war. American pilots, including the famous Flying Aces, engaged in aerial combat and reconnaissance missions over the Western Front, further demonstrating the advancements and expansion of the military during this time. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 had a significant effect on the military, causing widespread illness and casualties among its ranks. Despite this, the military size continued to swell, reaching a peak of 2.9 million active duty members in 1918. However, following the end of World War I with the Versailles Treaty in 1919, the size of the military decreased significantly to 1,173,000 active duty members. The war and subsequent treaty played a significant role in shaping the post-war order and the U.S. military's future doctrine, organization, and technology. The 1920s were a decade of significant change for the U.S. military. In 1920, the active duty count stood at 343,000. This number fluctuated over the decade due to various factors, including shifts in policy, advancements in technology, and international diplomatic efforts. One of the key events in this period was the National Defense Act of 1920, which reorganized the U.S. Army and established the Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC. This reform led to an initial increase in active duty numbers to 387,000 by 1921 as the military sought to modernize and increase its readiness. However, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 served as a critical turning point. This treaty aimed to limit the naval arms race, directly affecting U.S. naval construction and strategy. The effect of this treaty was a marked decrease in active duty members to 270,000 by 1922. Despite this, the military continued to innovate, with the establishment of the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1926. This development expanded the role of military aviation and led to a gradual rise in active duty members throughout the mid-1920s. Yet, the military was not only focused on warfare and defense. In fact, the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 saw the military deploying its members in relief efforts, a clear indication of the diverse roles the military played in society. Internationally, the military was also involved in overseas interventions, with deployments in Nicaragua from 1927 to 1933 and Haiti from 1915 to 1934. These interventions highlighted the ongoing U.S. military presence in the Caribbean, which contributed to maintaining a steady number of active duty members close to 250,000 in the latter part of the decade. The decade also marked a significant shift towards diplomacy, as evidenced by the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. This pact renounced war as an instrument of national policy and reflected a new approach to international relations. This shift, however, had little effect on the active duty count, which remained relatively stable, reaching 255,000 by the end of the decade. In summary, the 1920s were a decade of transformation for the U.S. military. The fluctuating active duty count throughout the decade was a reflection of the broader societal, political, and technological changes that were taking place. Whether through reform, diplomacy, or intervention, the military was an active participant in these changes, adapting and evolving to meet the challenges and opportunities of the time. In the 1930s, the United States military faced a tumultuous period marked by significant shifts in size and readiness. The decade opened with an active duty force of 256,000, a number influenced by a variety of socio-political events and policies. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, had an immediate and profound impact on the U.S. military. As the country grappled with economic hardship, military spending was significantly reduced, leading to a decrease in active duty forces. By 1932, the military count had dropped to 245,000. This economic crisis not only reduced the size of the military but also affected its readiness and capabilities, as resources were scarce and morale low. While the Depression was ongoing, the U.S. government adopted a policy of isolationism, reflected in the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s. These laws limited U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts, further reducing the need for a large, active military force. However, despite these challenges, the military began making significant strides towards modernization. The U.S. Navy, for example, initiated substantial upgrades to its fleet, constructing new aircraft carriers and battleships. These advancements were aimed at adapting to the evolving nature of naval warfare and ensured a slow but steady increase in the size of the Navy. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt established the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, a program aimed at employing young men in conservation projects. While not initially intended as a military initiative, the CCC provided a substantial pool of potential military recruits, which helped to bolster the size of the military to 252,000 by 1935. The U.S. Army Air Corps also made significant strides in aviation during this period, developing new bomber aircraft such as the B-17 Flying Fortress. This advancement expanded the strategic capabilities of the military and contributed to a gradual increase in military personnel, reaching 291,000 by 1936. International incidents also influenced the size of the U.S. military during this decade. For instance, the Panay Incident in 1937, which involved a Japanese attack on a U.S. Navy gunboat in China, sparked increased tensions in the Pacific. In response, the U.S. began to ramp up its military presence, reflected in an increase to 312,000 active duty personnel by 1937. The latter part of the decade saw the beginnings of World War II with the Munich Agreement in 1938 and the German invasion of Poland in 1939. These events foreshadowed U.S. involvement in the conflict, leading to further increases in the size of the military, which reached 334,000 by 1939. Thus, the 1930s were a decade of considerable transformation for the U.S. military. Despite economic hardships and isolationist policies, the force managed to adapt and grow, responding to global tensions and the increasing likelihood of war. By the end of the decade, the U.S. military was on the precipice of becoming a significant actor on the global stage. In the 1940s, the United States saw a significant expansion in the size of its military due to various key events. At the beginning of the decade in 1940, military personnel numbered approximately 458,000. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, which established the first peacetime draft in U.S. history, played a significant role in increasing the number of active duty military members. The following year saw the number quadruple to about 1.8 million, primarily due to the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which led to the U.S. entry into World War II. The scale of the Second World War, which spanned from 1939 to 1945, necessitated a massive expansion of the U.S. military. By 1943, the military size had ballooned to over 9 million, with the U.S. Army alone growing to over 8 million soldiers. This increase was also fueled by significant U.S. military forces involved in the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944, a major Allied offensive against Nazi Germany. The military size peaked in 1945 with approximately 12.1 million active duty members. This coincided with the final stages of World War II, marked by key U.S. victories such as the Battle of Midway and the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific against Japan. The development of atomic weapons during the Manhattan Project also played a part in shaping the military strategy and spending during this period. The post-war years saw a reduction in military personnel, dropping to about 3 million by 1946. The GI Bill of 1944 significantly impacted the post-war society and economy, providing education and housing benefits to millions of World War II veterans. This had a considerable influence on military recruitment and retention in the following years. The latter part of the decade saw a reorganization of the U.S. military with the National Security Act of 1947. This act established the Department of Defense and the U.S. Air Force, restructuring the military and influencing its size. By 1948, despite the challenges posed by the Berlin airlift, military personnel had reduced to around 1.4 million. By the end of the decade in 1949, the military size slightly increased to about 1.6 million, influenced by the intensifying Cold War arms race following the Soviet Union's development of atomic weapons. This marked a pivotal point in U.S. military strategy and spending, setting the stage for the military landscape in the decades to follow. The 1950s was a decade of considerable growth and transformation for the United States military. The decade began with the United States entering the Korean War in 1950, which led to the U.S. military growing from 1.46 million active duty personnel in 1950 to 3.24 million in 1951. As the United States staunchly defended South Korea against North Korean aggression, the military continued to swell, reaching its peak in 1952 with 3.64 million active duty personnel. The Cold War also played a significant role in influencing the size of the U.S. military during this decade. Throughout the 1950s, the U.S. Navy was instrumental in establishing a global presence to counter Soviet influence. This strategic positioning necessitated a well-staffed and capable military, contributing to the high levels of active duty personnel. The development of nuclear deterrence was another key factor that influenced the military's growth. The U.S. Air Force was actively developing its strategic bomber force and intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities, which further necessitated a robust military force. The Eisenhower administration's New Look policy, which emphasized nuclear deterrence and air power, also played a pivotal role in shaping military strategy and spending, likely contributing to the 3.55 million active duty personnel in 1953. However, by 1954, the count began to decrease slightly to approximately 3.30 million. This year was also significant for the U.S. Army as it began integrating its forces, following President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948. This monumental step towards diversity and equality in the military may have also had an impact on the number of active duty personnel. In the mid-50s, while the personnel count continued to decrease, the U.S. military was still engaged in significant operations and developments. The U.S. Marine Corps demonstrated its amphibious capabilities in the Korean War's Battle of Chosin Reservoir. Simultaneously, the U.S. Navy was enhancing its underwater capabilities by developing its nuclear-powered submarine fleet, beginning with the USS Nautilus in 1954. In the latter half of the decade, the United States remained heavily involved in international military affairs. The establishment of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, in 1954 led to increased U.S. military commitments in the region. In addition, the Formosa Resolution of 1955 authorized U.S. military intervention in defense of Taiwan, a move that reflected the ongoing Cold War tensions with China. By the end of the decade, the active duty personnel count had dropped to 2.32 million. However, the launch of Sputnik 1 by the Soviet Union in 1957 had intensified the space race and its military implications. This event marked a new frontier in defense priorities, setting the stage for future growth and transformation in the U.S. military in the decades to follow. In the 1960s, a confluence of global events and domestic issues dramatically influenced the size and deployment of the United States military. The decade began with an active-duty military personnel count of around 2.3 million in 1960, a number that would see significant fluctuations over the ensuing years. One of the key events that shaped the size and spending of the U.S. military during the 1960s was the Vietnam War. The U.S. had already established a military presence in South Vietnam throughout the 1950s and early 1960s in support of the South Vietnamese government against the Communist Viet Cong. However, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964 authorized expanded U.S. military involvement, leading to increased troop levels. By 1966, the active-duty military count had risen to over 3 million. The Vietnam War not only influenced the size of the military but also the way it was composed. With the escalation of the war, conscription provided much of the manpower. In 1969, the draft lottery system was introduced, causing a significant impact on both military recruitment and social equity. Military operations during the Vietnam War were diverse and complicated, involving extensive bombing campaigns such as Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Linebacker, which were conducted by the U.S. Air Force. In addition, the U.S. Marines demonstrated their resilience and adaptability in key battles like Khe Sanh and Hue City in 1968. The U.S. Navy also played a crucial role, with their riverine forces conducting operations in the Mekong Delta and other inland waterways. However, the Vietnam War was not the only global event affecting the U.S. military in the 1960s. The Cold War also significantly influenced military strategy and spending. Key confrontations like the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 necessitated the involvement of U.S. military forces. Especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. Navy blockaded Cuba, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. Simultaneously, the U.S. military was involved in other interventions such as the Dominican Civil War in 1965, reflecting the country's ongoing military interventions in the Caribbean. Also, the U.S. military was directly involved in the civil rights movement, with federal troops enforcing desegregation and providing security. The size and capabilities of the U.S. military also expanded due to advancements in nuclear deterrence. The U.S. Navy developed its fleet of ballistic missile submarines, enhancing its nuclear deterrence capabilities. Despite these various global confrontations and domestic issues, the active-duty military count started to decline towards the end of the decade. The withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam began in 1969 under the Nixon administration's Vietnamization policy, aiming to transfer responsibility to the South Vietnamese military. Consequently, the active-duty count reduced to around 3.46 million by the end of the decade. The 1960s were a transformative period for the U.S. military, significantly influenced by global events and domestic issues. The changes in the active-duty military count reflect the country's responses to these challenges and the evolving role of the U.S. military on the world stage. In the 1970s, the size of the U.S. military underwent significant changes. The beginning of the decade saw over 3 million active-duty military personnel, a number that was deeply influenced by the ongoing Vietnam War. However, as the conflict continued, the U.S. began to gradually withdraw troops, significantly impacting the number of military personnel. By the time the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, the count had fallen to just over 2 million. This downward trend continued even after the fall of Saigon in 1975, which marked the end of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The reassessment of U.S. military strategy and foreign policy following the Vietnam War, along with the transition to an all-volunteer force in 1973, had a profound effect on the military count. This shift away from conscription meant that the military had to rely on volunteers, which led to a slight drop in numbers. The 1970s also saw significant advancements in technology, particularly within the Navy and Air Force. In 1975, the Navy introduced the nuclear-powered Nimitz-class carriers, a major milestone in naval technology. Meanwhile, The Air Force was busy modernizing its fighter and bomber fleets, introducing the advanced F-15, F-16, and B-1 aircraft. These developments, while not directly affecting the number of personnel, required significant investment and reflected the U.S. military's commitment to maintaining a technological edge. Amid these advancements, the U.S. military was not without its challenges. The Iran hostage crisis, which began in 1979, saw U.S. military rescue attempts and significantly shaped U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. This crisis, coupled with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the same year, marked a new phase in the Cold War and necessitated a robust military response. In response to these growing global challenges, the U.S. military budget saw an increase in the late 1970s under the Carter administration. This came despite a slight decrease in the number of active duty personnel, which hovered around 2 million by the end of the decade. In terms of special operations, the U.S. Army made a significant move in 1977 by establishing the Delta Force, a unit focused on counterterrorism and hostage rescue. This innovative approach to military strategy reflected the changing nature of global conflicts and the need for specialized skills and tactics. In essence, the 1970s was a decade of transition and transformation for the U.S. military, marked by significant changes in strategy, policy, and technology. The 1980s marked a pivotal time for the U.S. military, with changing international relations and evolving technology significantly impacting military strategy, operations, and size. During this decade, the number of active duty military personnel fluctuated, reflecting the various events and policies of the period. The Reagan administration, beginning in 1981, set into motion a significant military buildup. This strategic decision was reflected in an increase in defense spending and a rise in the number of military personnel, which grew from 2.05 million in 1980 to over 2.1 million by 1981, and continued to expand to 2.27 million by 1986. In the midst of this buildup, the U.S. military was actively involved in various overseas interventions. Notably, the invasion of Grenada in 1983 and the bombing of Libya in 1986 demanded a robust military force. This active engagement in international conflicts likely contributed to the peak personnel count of 2.28 million in 1987. Simultaneously, the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 was enacted, reorganizing the U.S. military and fortifying the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This legislation, coupled with the ongoing military buildup, could have played a part in maintaining the high personnel count during the mid-1980s. However, the military personnel count began to decline towards the end of the decade. This downward trend could be attributed to several factors, including the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty in 1987. This agreement eliminated a class of nuclear weapons, potentially influencing U.S. military strategy and the size of the armed forces. Moreover, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the end of the Cold War, prompting a reassessment of U.S. military priorities. This significant geopolitical event, along with the invasion of Panama that same year, might have shaped the reduction in military personnel, with the count dropping to 2.24 million. The decade also saw the U.S. military's involvement in the Persian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War, assistance to the Contras in Nicaragua, operations against Libya in the Gulf of Sidra, and the development of the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter. These events and initiatives, intertwined with the broader historical context, shaped the size and composition of the U.S. military throughout the 1980s. In the 1990s, the United States military was in a state of flux, with the size of its active duty forces experiencing significant changes. At the onset of the decade, the military had roughly 2.18 million active duty members, a figure that was heavily influenced by the Gulf War, where a substantial U.S. military deployment was necessitated to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. However, this number experienced an overall decline throughout the decade, dipping to 1.49 million by 1999. Several key events can be attributed to the changes in active duty forces during the 1990s. The end of the Cold War led to a reduction in U.S. military personnel and a shift towards regional conflicts and peacekeeping operations. This period, often referred to as the post-Cold War era, marked a major transition for the military, with force levels and spending experiencing substantial reductions. This decrease in military spending was often described as the peace dividend of the 1990s. The U.S. military was also heavily involved in the Balkans in the mid to late 1990s. Operations in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1995 and Kosovo in 1999 required significant commitment of U.S. forces, particularly from the U.S. Air Force, which played a key role in NATO's bombing campaign against Serbia during the Kosovo War. The operations in the Adriatic Sea during the Yugoslav wars also necessitated a significant naval presence. Peacekeeping missions were another prominent aspect of U.S. military activity during this decade. The U.S. Army was involved in operations in Somalia from 1992 to 1994 and Haiti from 1994 to 1995. These peacekeeping operations contributed to the overall active duty forces count, with troops deployed to ensure stability and peace in these regions. However, the decade was not without its challenges. In 1991, the tailhook scandal highlighted issues of sexual harassment and assault in the U.S. Navy, leading to reforms and a renewed focus on the treatment of personnel within the military. The bombing of the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia in 1996, which killed 19 U.S. Air Force members, underscored the increasing threat of terrorism, shaping the military's approach to security and force protection. Overall, the 1990s was a decade of transformation for the U.S. military, with the end of the Cold War, regional conflicts, peacekeeping missions, and internal reforms shaping the size and structure of its active duty forces. At the start of the 2000s decade, the United States military consisted of approximately 1.36 million active duty members. The September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001, however, marked a significant turning point for the U.S. military. The incident led to the initiation of the global war on terrorism, which significantly impacted the military's size and spending, resulting in an increase in personnel count to about 1.39 million. The global war on terrorism involved U.S. military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. When the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001, the military's numbers rose to around 1.414 million due to the necessity for a long-term counterinsurgency and nation-building mission. This trend continued through 2003 when the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, leading to a prolonged insurgency and a further increase in military personnel to 1.4 million. As the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan dragged on, the military adopted a counterinsurgency strategy emphasizing winning hearts and minds. This approach, along with the ever-increasing demand for manpower for these conflicts, caused the numbers to rise to nearly 1.5 million by 2004. In response to the strain and overextension that the Army and Marine Corps experienced due to the demands of the wars, the U.S. military began developing and expanding the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. They found use in surveillance and combat operations, providing a much-needed respite for the overworked forces. Despite this, the force's size continued to grow, reaching a peak of 1.55 million by 2006. In 2007, a troop surge took place in Iraq, temporarily reducing violence and improving security. The U.S. military continued to evolve throughout the decade, expanding its special operations forces and their global missions, particularly in counterterrorism operations. This trend, in addition to the U.S. Navy's anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia, helped maintain a stable force size, with the numbers hovering around 1.5 million by the end of the decade in 2009. However, the decade ended on a sober note with the Fort shooting in 2009, killing 13 U.S. military members. The tragic event highlighted the threat of insider attacks and domestic terrorism, marking yet another challenge for the continually evolving U.S. military. The 2010s were a significant and transformative period for the United States military. The decade started with the military in active combat in both Iraq and Afghanistan, with approximately 1.58 million active duty members. The U.S. military began to draw down forces from Iraq in 2010 and Afghanistan in 2011, transitioning to support and training missions. This strategic shift contributed to a gradual decrease in the active duty personnel count, dropping to around 1.56 million in 2011 and 2012. Simultaneously, the U.S. military was involved in new strategic operations. One such operation was Operation Inherent Resolve, where the U.S. military conducted airstrikes and special operations against the Islamic State, ISIS, in Iraq and Syria. Despite the active engagement in this operation, the overall active duty personnel count continued its downward trend. In different parts of the world, the U.S. Navy was flexing its muscles in the South China Sea, challenging China's territorial claims through freedom of navigation operations. Furthermore, under the European Reassurance Initiative, the U.S. military provided support to its NATO allies in Eastern Europe, reinforcing its strategic alliances. The 2010s also saw significant changes in the composition of the military with the integration of women into combat roles, following policy changes in 2013 and 2015. This was a landmark shift in U.S. military policy, expanding the pool of personnel eligible for combat roles. At the same time, the U.S. military was modernizing its arsenal. The Air Force was developing new fifth-generation fighter aircraft, such as the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II. The Army was modernizing its ground combat vehicles and artillery systems as part of the Brigade Combat Team Modernization Program. The U.S. military was also involved in humanitarian assistance, providing disaster relief operations, such as the response to the 2010 Haiti earthquake. These operations were critical in showcasing the military's capacity for rapid response and its commitment to global humanitarian efforts. In the realm of cybersecurity, the U.S. military was advancing its capabilities, establishing the U.S. Cyber Command in 2010. This new command reflected the changing nature of warfare and the increasing importance of cybersecurity. However, the 2010s were also a period of budgetary constraints for the U.S. military. Sequestration and budget caps affected readiness and modernization. Despite these challenges, by the end of the decade, the active duty personnel count had stabilized and even slightly increased, reaching around 1.39 million in 2019. In summary, the 2010s were a decade of transformation for the U.S. military. Despite fluctuating active duty numbers, the military adapted and evolved in response to shifting global conflicts, changing societal norms, advancements in technology, and budgetary constraints. As the 2020s dawned, the United States military found itself in a state of flux. The military's active duty count in 2020 stood at approximately 1.39 million, reflecting the demands of a globally engaged force. This period was marked by the ongoing great power competition with China and Russia, as outlined in the 2018 National Defense Strategy. This strategic shift necessitated a focus on modernization and technological advancement, which impacted both the size and composition of the military. In 2021, a significant event further affected the U.S. military's size and deployment. The long-anticipated Afghanistan withdrawal finally came to fruition, ending a 20-year presence in the Middle Eastern nation. This event led to a reduction in active duty service members to around 1.32 million, as troops were repatriated and resources were redirected. However, the size of the military remained relatively steady in 2022, with approximately 1.34 million active duty members. This period saw increased emphasis on the Indo-Pacific region, with the U.S. military conducting freedom of navigation operations in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. Amid rising tensions with China, these operations demanded a sizable and capable naval presence. The advent of the Space Force in 2019 began to make its impact felt in the 2020s. As the newest branch of the military, the Space Force required personnel, funding, and resources, contributing to a complex picture of military spending and size. The COVID-19 pandemic also had significant implications for the military. The need for logistical support and medical assistance in response to the crisis added another dimension to the military's role, and may have influenced personnel numbers and budgetary considerations. As of 2024, so far the US has not committed to significant on-the-ground presence in Eastern Europe or the Middle East. Nevertheless, countries like Germany are restarting the discussion on mandatory military service. What will happen in the US if conflicts in Europe escalates further? Meanwhile, investment in emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, continue to be a priority for the military. The drive to maintain a technological edge in an increasingly digital battlefield likely influenced spending and resource allocation. In addition, the U.S. Navy's development of new unmanned systems, including surface and underwater vehicles, contributed to a shift in the nature of military capabilities. This evolution, along with the U.S. Army's focus on modernization priorities like long-range precision fires and air and missile defense, required both financial investment and personnel training. The U.S. Marine Corps, meanwhile, embarked on a significant transformation with its Force Design 2030 plan. With an emphasis on distributed operations and anti-ship capabilities, this plan may have influenced the size and structure of the Marine Corps. Throughout this decade, the defense budget debates have been a constant backdrop. Balancing the need for modernization with fiscal constraints and competing domestic priorities has been, and continues to be, a significant challenge for the military. This ongoing dialogue undoubtedly influences the number of active duty service members, as the military must adapt to meet both its budgetary restrictions and operational requirements. By 2024, the active duty count was approximately 1.28 million, reflecting these complex and ever-changing factors. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please press the like button. Also share your comments, I want to hear from you. The number of U.S. personnel has been somewhat steady over the past 20 years. What will happen when artificial intelligence, drones, and robots become more prevalent in modern-day warfare?